You're listening to Artistic Finance, show 188. On today's show, we talk with projection designer Sven Ortel about career finances. We discuss being persistent, insisting you get credit for your work, organizing your taxes and writing things down, and separating the production budget from the design budget. I do want to mention that Sven and I met while I was a visiting professor at Arizona State University. That's not actually why I interviewed him today. A while back, I mentioned on the podcast that I was looking to interview designers other than lighting designers because I have been doing so many of those. And somebody messaged me and said there's a projection designer named Sven Ortel who would be amazing to listen to. And I thought, well, hey, I can make that happen. That being said, I'm still interviewing way too many lighting designers. So if you know of any other designers, costume designers, projection designers, sound, whatever, and you'd love to hear from them, reach out and let me know who I should get a hold of. Now, without further ado, let's get to the show.
You are listening to Artistic Finance, where we help creatives learn about the business of show business.
Welcome and thank you for listening. I am your host, Ethan Steimel. We are recording this March 13th, 2025, and the news today is just like every day, billionaires are meddling in U.S. politics. And the most recent thing that I just saw was that Trump is threatening a 200% tax or tariff on European alcohol coming to the United States. But we're going to ignore that all, and we are going to welcome to the show Sven Ortel. Welcome, Sven.
Hi, it's great to be here.
I'm calling you a projection designer, but nowadays, I don't know how many times it's projections versus video, etc. Is projection designer what you sign on to?
It's the local 829 credit. So if I design a commercial show on a union contract, it's projection designer. It's on a projection designer cover sheet because that's the category. That doesn't stop people from calling themselves other things, but I've always been partial to projection designer.
This is perfect because now I can go to other people. If anybody ever corrects me and says, no, I'm a media designer or I'm a video designer.
People have strong feelings about it for various reasons. I mean, I lived in the UK for 10 years and the credit was video designer for the same thing. And then you go to the US and people that call themselves video designers do a lot of live capture manipulation, because they're manipulating actual video feeds. I actually have an article about the credit on one of my websites.
Amazing. I'm going to go find it and I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes and I'm going to read it because I'm curious. But what I took away from that is I can say projection designer because that's the USA 829 designation.
I think it's the official title. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. So Sven, we know you're a projection designer, and now we've learned that you spent 10 years in the UK, and profiling from your accent, I would guess German. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your life and career?
Yeah, I got into theater somewhat by accident in high school, and I was just curious about things, and I just ran into a bunch of people that are putting on a theater show at my high school in Cologne in Germany. And at the time I was rigging and patching and operating lights at a nightclub. So that's mostly parkans and ACL battens that are sort of parkans wired in series. And I would operate it, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I discovered that I really enjoyed the lighting part of life, I guess. That's how I discovered it, despite a woman sat next to me and her brothers ran a rental shop. And she asked whether I was good with electricity. And I was kind of, well, I mean, I can wire a light bulb. It's like, okay, that's enough. And then she said, you should talk to my brothers. So I got the job at that nightclub. And that's how I got into lighting. And then it was basically music. It was sort of house and techno at the time. And I got into the high school jolly band of misfits, I suppose, as usual. And I really enjoyed making lighting for a responsive live audience. I didn't have those words at the time, but I really enjoyed that you could actually sense what impact your work was having. And I tried to pursue that. I mean, I studied for 2 semesters in Cologne, Russian, semiotics, and English. But I saw an advertisement for a lighting designer to design lighting for Antigone in a bunch of air raid shelters around town, and I applied for it and I got it, and I got a really great review, and I thought I found my calling. I also found out that I can't live off it. So I continued doing the nightclub thing, and the night clubbing turned into lighting movies or being an electrician on movies, which I really enjoyed. So I worked as an electrician, best boy, gaffer on smaller things for about 5 to 6 years. And that's where I learned how to file my taxes and set up my business in Germany at the time, and how to be insured and all that stuff, and how to set up a freelancer type structure. Because, every electrician was a freelancer, and you were making good money at the time. And, that was at the time where, we're using incandescent lights and film. That has all changed, even though the work probably hasn't changed massively. But it was a great time. But yeah, go on.
So just to clarify time-wise, so you started in the nightclub in high school, and then you were doing, then you got into the film stuff like in college? Is Germany the same way, where it's like high school, then college, and then you're out?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you like to structure your lives and how you want to meet your parents' expectations, I suppose, or whoever else is, making you feel you should be doing certain things. But I wasn't really thinking about that. I was there at the time. There was still mandatory military service in Germany, and you could refuse that on the base of conscience. That was sort of the legal term, where you basically would say, I can't reconciliate holding a gun for this and that reason. And in my case, that would be because my grandparents had, very harrowing experiences, and they still couldn't talk about what happened. And, at the time, I was 17. I didn't want anything to do with it. So, that meant an equivalent of, I think at the time, 18 months of civil service. And you need to find basically the job of civil service. You could be working in a charity. You could be working in a senior living facility. You could be driving an ambulance. It all depends. But I found a job as a kind of a fill-in kind of guy who would, whenever somebody fell out somewhere or was sick, I would basically take over their job. So I'd ride my bike to a different part of town and, take somebody to the barber shop, or do the shopping for somebody, or clean their windows. And it was kind of fascinating because that generation, of course, doesn't function like my generation, let alone my parents' generation, because they all went through the war. So I learned a lot about the trauma that comes with not knowing what's tomorrow and not knowing what you're going to have. So some people had just stuff piled to the ceiling. Some people used cleaning techniques from 1920. It was kind of fascinating and humbling in a way. And so it was definitely a great experience. But they also paid for my rent.
Ah, I see. Okay, so you finished high school and then you did 18 months of this?
Yeah, and then I still worked on weekends in the nightclub, like basically from Friday to Monday night or Monday morning, I would work in the nightclub. And then I studied, and then I discovered that I needed a second source of income. So I I did an internship or placement as a lighting placement that I also had to apply for. And then it is always a crew, right? It's always a gaffer and a couple of electricians and a Jenny operator, etc. So I did a placement, and then they took me on, and you basically become a unit that sort of does productions together. And I tried to do theater shows at the side, and I mean, I enjoyed the work on movie sets and traveling around and the people. It just, after a while, it didn't sort of address my creative streak, which I also discovered through this, that I actually wanted to be creative because I was missing it. So at some point I said, listen, I've got to find out whether this is really the thing I should be doing, because I always felt I should be a lighting designer. So I applied I applied local colleges that didn't take me in Cologne, and there wasn't, of course, a lighting design degree that didn't exist. But in London there was, and they took me, and so I left everything behind, and I moved to London and studied lighting design for 3 years. Then I discovered in my second year that I was really fascinated by projection. At the time, there was large scale slide projection, and video projection was just coming into the theater, usually via international artists touring to places like the National Theatre or the Barbican in London. And I thought, I want to know how to do that. So I wrote my BA thesis about the use of video projection in contemporary theater. And I was very excited, and I got a job very quickly at the National Theatre because I was just lucky. I was also pretty persistent. So, not many people were doing it at the time. So if you were working on something that was semi-visible, people will hire you and particularly at a place like the National Theatre, which of course is a stellar reputation for a reason, that if you were working there doing something, it was association by fame or reputation, and they'll hire you because you worked at the National Theatre. And after I got my first, it was a video designer credit at the National Theatre, I got hired to design other things across Europe, which, I mean, it's all a fluke. I mean, it wasn't a plan none of this was a plan. I would just sort of go by gut instinct and whether I liked somebody. It was a director who hired me to design an opera in Zurich at the Zurich Opera House, straight off that show, Measure for Measure at the National Theatre, because he came to the opening, and I said, yeah, sure, cool. I love Zurich, and I worked there, and then I got a call while I was there from another director I hadn't met, but I was recommended, and she noticed that I was in Zurich, and she figured I could speak German, and so she hired me to design Rebecca the musical in Vienna, pretty much that same summer, because somebody else fell out, and I don't remember the reason, but I was replacing somebody, and that was how I got into musical theater. I was there. I knew kind of what I was doing because I was working at big houses, and there weren't many people doing it. And I did a good job on Rebecca, and then she hired me to design a video for The Little Mermaid on Broadway. It wasn't just like that, but it was almost just like that because there weren't many people doing it. And the hardest thing was, getting a visa and traveling, and the long periods of tryouts that were common at the time, which was kind of close to 3 months out of town. But yeah, I figured this could be my pension. That's why I did it.
The timeline wise, you were in Cologne. 5-6 years you spent working film, but then you went to school. Just what year was it that you were in school?
I graduated in 93 from high school. And then I I spent a year and a half doing social service. I was working in nightclubs, and then in 95-ish to 99, I was working as an electrician, best boy gaffer type movie lighting, basically designing the odd off show in Cologne, around Cologne. But that was it. And then in 99, I moved to London to study lighting design, and I graduated in 2002. I think in 2004, I designed Measure for Measure at the National Theatre. And that was basically the kickoff for my freelance projection designer career. Because once I got the credit, people knew who had done what. And then, that show toured around the world. So it was great. It was a good time.
Got it. So 2004, you did your first national theater, and then Little Mermaid on Broadway was 2008. Did it start on Broadway? Did it start somewhere else?
Yeah. It started in Denver, actually. I was in Denver for 3 months, and I think must have been 2007. So yeah, there were a couple of things in between, but also those shows have a long lead up time of planning. For Little Mermaid, it was interesting from a financial perspective, because that was of course, a very commercial venture. So I had to figure out how to account for making imagery versus design fees. And, I talked to a couple of people about a lot of the stuff. I sort of compared it to how a scenic designer would manage a budget, or a shop would manage a budget. So there is a budget for making the design or realizing the design, and that's kind of what became what I call the content budget, which is not my fee, particularly on a show like this, right? So, and then there are assistants, there are interns, there is studio costs, there is all sorts of costs. So I kind of developed categories of stuff, but I definitely made the decision to separate the production part from the design part. And I would ask for a specific budget for realizing the design that I had created. In the same way that a shop would build a set, only that it turned out to be very impractical to have a third party make your content. In a way, it would work, I don't know, in other areas of the industries. It was much easier and cheaper if you did this as another part of your studio or your practice. It's kind of like a design build kind of studio. You design it, and then over here, the people make it, but the money comes out of a different pot.
Wow. Okay. All right. So then Little Mermaid, from there, jumping to today.
I mean, today I am living in Mesa, Arizona, and I teach classes that are largely concern themselves with creating meaning and telling stories using media, but it's not necessarily theater. In other words, it could be any experience or any narrative-driven environment that relies on a live audience to be present, to function. So I focus on basically using the creative process and the engagement that is unique to theatrical performances as a foundation to teach and develop processes that allow students or anybody who comes to me to create meaningful experiences. So it could be somebody who works in VR and AR. It could be somebody designing, experience designer, you name it. And I design 1 or 2 shows, theater shows a year. And I try to also design other things that are not theater more often than not, whenever the opportunity arises, just because I'm fascinated by other forms of storytelling. And I got here, so basically I seem to change course every 7 or so years, because I get a little bored, I mean, it's a strong word. I don't get bored. I feel like I've reached a point where I'm not curious enough anymore to justify being in a certain place. I'm always looking for things that somehow I find fascinating or fulfilling. I designed a bunch of shows on Broadway between, say, 2008 and 2012. And I have designed as well, but I was full-time designing during those years. And I was living in Brooklyn at the time, after I moved there from London. I was accidentally hired to teach a class at UCLA, and I think it was 2012. The students filled out a survey who they want to bring in, and the professor leading the design program, Myung-Hae Cho, she basically had tried to get money together for years to bring a projection designer in, and a couple of people signed up. They're all canceled one after the other, and I was the last one standing. I had just designed Julie Taymor's Midsummer Night's Dream in Brooklyn. And that was kind of a 8-month stint, and I was exhausted. So, having the opportunity to, teach media design to basically people who are curious but knew nothing in a warm place, seemed like a great thing to do. And I loved it. I've been told by quite a few people that class turned out to be legendary because it was hard to get into apparently, and everybody somehow has been successful who graduated from that and decided to become a media designer. And I didn't know what I was doing, which meant that the classes were between 4 and 10 hours long on a Saturday. And nobody told me how long it should be, when to take breaks. I think I had 12 students and I gave 45-minute feedback sessions to each of them. So it took a while. So I gave them exercises of things to do, and I had built a website that they could use as a reference, and then they'd come back and they wanted to hear my feedback, and so I gave them feedback, and the others enjoyed hearing the feedback about their colleagues. So it just became this thing that we did on Saturdays, but it went on, and I had no idea that was highly unusual. They had to ask me to take a break or whether they could eat something. I was just excited.
Wait, was the class period, was it for a whole semester on Saturdays, or did you just meet on Saturday instead?
Yeah, it was a whole semester. I mean, it was a 10-week semester. I think they do thirds. So, but still, that's pretty intense.
I've never heard of a 10-hour class ever.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of one since either. But I would come in on a Friday night. I have dinner somewhere in Westwood, and then I at 10 o'clock I'll meet the students, and we finish when we finish.
Wow, that's amazing. All right. We have learned a lot about you. This is amazing. I want to ask, let me ask a couple icebreaker questions to get them out of the way. And then I have follow-ups from what you've already told us. What is a live event that you like to experience from an audience perspective?
Musical theater. Really. I love musical theater. It doesn't even need to be a musical that I like. I just like seeing, how all the different disciplines kind of integrate with one another, and I just find it a fascinating genre because everything has to click together so tightly to make it work. I really enjoy watching it, and immersive experience. I go just because I'm a sucker for punishment. I teach that stuff, but I go in knowing that this is probably gonna be bad in some way or another. And because I'm a theater guy, and most people that put these on don't think about the audience experience so much. It's a lot of snazzy visuals, but I do enjoy it in a kind of almost I don't know, like it's like, oh my God, they didn't do this. This is so obvious. Why didn't you? Oh my gosh, that's a poor choice. I don't know. And you can talk. Yeah, it's kind of weird. I like those big immersive experiences.
I love that you said I love musicals, even ones that I don't like.
I mean, where I don't like the music or even the subject, the economy and the sort of the mechanics of putting these things together is just really fascinating, engaging to me. And that even when I'm not following the story 100%, I am fascinated by what I think is going on behind the scenes.
All right, your financial personality. Are you good, bad, or neutral with money?
I think I'm pretty good. But doing taxes is one of the most uncomfortable things. And I've been through various iterations of doing it. But I've been with the same accountant for 10 years now. And it's an accountant that specializes on Broadway designers. They even bring out every January, you get a cover sheet that has a tax tune that has the lyrics changed to be basically good tax advice. It's basically a musical number, a well-known musical number every year, and it has the lyrics changed to remind you to file your 1099s, et cetera, et cetera.
That's hilarious. What is the name of your accountant or company?
The company is called Trudy C Durant. They're very well known, and I've been with them for 10 years. That doesn't make it less comfortable to have a great accountant.
So since we're talking about taxes already, I'm just going to jump ahead here. The taxes in Germany versus here, were you filing your taxes in Germany, or did you have somebody there help you?
I mean, I don't file my taxes in Germany anymore because I'm an American citizen, so that doesn't work. But it's always down to residency and where the money originates generally. So I've designed a lot of international shows over the years, so it always got more complicated than a piece of software would allow, or even a regular accountant would understand, in my experience. So which is how I ended up where I ended up, because there's a lot of subtlety and different aspects of the income that make it requires a personal touch and experience to navigate all that complexity. I categorize everything and I prepare a lot, but I don't file it.
Being a U.S. citizen, when did that happen?
2016. But even as a green card holder, it's as a permanent resident, I file my taxes as if I was an American citizen. So I haven't filed taxes in Germany for a really long time, but probably not since 99. And after that, of course, I did my taxes in the UK, and I think I did them myself. It was pretty straightforward, and I didn't have that many kind of weird and wonderful income streams. It was pretty straightforward back then. I don't know whether it has changed or not. And I write invoices and I have expenses, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, so I was talking about green card. This was curious to me because jumping countries is always a complication. I assume from Germany to the UK was probably pretty simple because you're all European Union.
At the time, yeah. At the time, that made no difference.
So but then you got the Broadway show, and I just assumed they gave you a work visa so you could do that.
Yeah, I got an O1 visa, and I mean that was not my first Broadway show, but the O1 visa basically meant that I could be there longer and also work for other employers for a little while. So I did. So I kind of made good use of that.
I see. Okay. So you got the visa to do a show, and then it worked. It lasted however long, and you were able to do more shows on that same visa.
Yeah.
And then you applied for the green card at some point?
Yeah, I decided at some point that after 8, 7 years, I was kind of ready to leave London. It's always you know, it's not just one reason. It's usually a variety of reasons. But I discovered around the 7 year mark, I got to get itchy to do something completely different or go somewhere else. Actually, I had 3 shows that took me almost around the world, one after the other. So I just packed up everything, and I did a show in Tokyo. I did a show in San Francisco, and then in New York, an off-Broadway show. And I basically decided if it feels right in one of these places, I'm going to consider maybe being there for a little while to figure out what's next. And I liked it in Brooklyn the best. And then a few years later, Little Mermaid came around, and that got me then the visa, which allowed me to stay and move full time to the US. And generally you have to apply for a permanent residency before the visa expires. So I did that through an attorney, and that worked out because I wanted to stay. I was very comfortable living where I was living until I wasn't. That has actually nothing to do with work. It was after Sandy. I had a studio in Red Hook, which is close to the water, and the first floor flooded, and we didn't have power for 3 months, and it just made me feel really vulnerable and stuck. And I couldn't really get out or go anywhere within under 2 hours. I couldn't get anywhere. So I just felt like this is not a good situation, and it didn't make me very comfortable about settling down. So in the back of my head, I had like, at some point when the opportunity offers itself, I'm probably going to leave this place. So I did eventually, but that had more to do with the fact that I met my wife and she moved to Texas.
Okay. Have you been with your wife longer than 7 years?
No.
Uh-oh. Does she know about this 7-year itch?
Yeah, she does. Oh, I know what you're saying. Oh, yeah. We've been together for much longer than 7 years now. Yeah.
Okay.
No, that doesn't apply to people.
Okay, all right. Applies to your career and your life.
Yeah.
And
that is sort of more career job satisfaction.
Okay, just I was starting to get worried there.
No, but she does know about the 7-year thing. She definitely does. We have talked about it, and then we move.
She's on board with your 7-year plans.
Yeah. So we moved to Texas, and then after 7 years, we were kind of ready to leave Texas, but the pandemic hit, so it took another 2 years, and then we moved to Arizona.
That is amazing. That's amazing. All right, Sven, I'm curious, growing up before your career started, did you have a good financial example?
No, it was all pretty terrible, in a sense that both my parents are academics, so they have a confident way talking about things theoretically. But I could see things kind of falling apart left, right, and center. I think my financial independence education actually happened when I was a teenager because my parents divorced, and my mother was struggling to make. She didn't struggle to make ends meet because she doesn't have any money. She was struggling to make ends meet because she didn't know how to prioritize decision making, and of course struggling emotionally. So it was a disaster, which meant that I started working as much as I could really early on, and I started, what's it called, like it's not paperboy, but I was basically taking magazines to people's houses, and I got a bit of money and tips from it when I was, I think, 13 going 14, and then I worked in shops, in retail, selling clothes, which you could legally do when you were 16, and then then I worked in the nightclubs, and that really provided a pretty enough income to pay not just my expenses, but I basically paid rent for the last 2 years that I lived at home. So because my mother was not able to for a variety of reasons. So I learned, being financially independent sort of by force. And also I couldn't ask anyone because the nature of divorce is that, people stop talking to each other. And that can also be true for relatives that used to talk to each other. And a lot of times the children are caught in the middle, and that was the case in my case as well. So I worked and I paid for things that I wanted, and it was it was quite liberating when it happened, but it was not something I chose. It was something I felt like I had to do, but it was great because basically I moved out basically with that confidence when I was 17. Yeah, I moved out when I was 17 and then, figured out how to have my rent paid and find my apartment. And, that was it. I haven't really had to ask anyone for anything to make a living or to pay for anything. My dad offered to pay for college when I moved to the UK because he paid for my sister. And I said, yeah, sure, great. What I didn't know at the time, like at the time, the pound was 3 times the value of the euro. So it's like, it wasn't a lot. But anyway, I made it through. And again, I worked in nightclubs being a light jockey. I was paid in cash. I think, I lived somewhat, under questionable circumstances in a Victorian, townhouse, where I paid cash as well. I made it through.
Well, my next question is, at the start of your career, what did your finances look like? So I guess let's just start that when you got out in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
Because of what you mentioned earlier, part of this question, I also want to ask about how you started setting up your business structure.
Yeah. No, I understand. So I had I set up a single member LLC pretty quickly because I knew that was the way to do it. And I talked to a bunch of people because I had designed a few Broadway shows. So I talked to programmers and technicians, even whilst I was still living in the UK, and asked them, how do you do this? How do you set this up? And, and I got various advice on LLCs and C Corps and S Corps and et cetera, et cetera. But I settled on the LLC.
Did you set that up before you did any of the Broadway shows, or is this something you set up over time?
When I was when I was working from the US. So when I was actually living in the US, I set up the LLC. But before that, I was resident in another country, which meant I would have the equivalent of an LLC in the UK.
Got it. And so you had that set up in the UK as well?
Yeah.
Got it.
And so there was a period of transition. And it was very awkward and clumsy. And there's a lot of these tax agreements between countries. Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's just work and paperwork. You just shouldn't ignore it. You just kind of have to deal with it and fill it out and send it back. I set up an LLC and just started working with the LLC, and I did that. That was the New York LLC, and after that, you transfer it to another state. And every state in the US has slightly different regulations about how to set up or run an LLC, or whether there is even a thing like a single member LLC. So sometimes you just have to dissolve it, and start it again under the same name in a different state, but keep the tax identification number. Keep the tax identification number. That's the trick. Otherwise, it gets tricky.
Okay. I just closed my New York one last year, and now I'm listening to you, and I'm like, well, I guess I could have just transferred it to Missouri.
Well, you can't transfer the LLC, but you can keep the tax identification number. I mean, it all depends on what it was. But I've always been a single member LLC. So because that's a pass-through entity anyway, and it's kind of associated with you as a person, that works. I mean, that's the extent of my knowledge, pretty much. Whenever I have questions, I ask my accountant, and then it's usually, why don't you give me a phone call?
So you said you were watching our tax prep episode.
Yeah.
I don't know how far you got into that, but basically, like, it sounds like we do our taxes the exact same way, where we just keep track of our expenses, we keep track of our income, and then we prep the receipts or save the receipts in categories, and we hand that off to somebody else. Is that what you do? The only difference here is that I don't have an LLC.
Yeah, and I do detailed expenses because of the expenses I have making imagery. So I have basic categories for stock footage, software and hardware that is dedicated to making the designs, and I put everything in there. And then there is the use of home office, divvying up all the utilities or whatever costs are associated with your work as far as you can reasonably argue. And I have a separate spreadsheet for that. I mean, now I have the most complicated thing. I had the good fortune of buying a house at the right time. So, and then I've moved a lot. So I have rental income. That is complicated to me because that functions a bit like another company that you happen to have.
Well, okay. So I want to ask you about that, but also, so when you're mentioning your home office expenses of like how much of the square footage is that, do you figure out the monetary value of that and put it in the spreadsheet for your accountant?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Because what I do is I say I have a 150 square foot office in a 4,000 square foot building, and then I let them figure it out.
I just say it's a 3-bedroom house. I use 1 bedroom, which means a third of the expenses are dedicated to that office. It's easier if it's rent because it's a direct expense. So I just divide basically all the utilities and the rent by the fraction of the bedroom that you're actually using relative to how many bedrooms the house has. And that's it. And then if somebody complains, I'll go, oh, okay, I didn't know this because I didn't.
You just taught me. I didn't realize that. Yeah. Okay. So if my office is 1/6 of the house, you just take all the utilities and divide by 1/6.
I do, like including internet, everything.
I didn't. Yeah. Let's see. Because I do include the utilities, but I don't know that I divided it into the 1/6 part. I did it differently. I was like, phone bill is half personal, half professional, and I wrote that half off.
I mean, that's the advice I was given years ago, and I've been doing it for a long time that way. And telephone is another one where I split the phone bill in half or in a third. I have to look it up.
No, this is great because I'm always looking for shortcuts. You've just taught me a new shortcut. And I'm not going to cheat on my taxes, Sven. But
no, I'm not suggesting that, but it does make sense.
No, but I'm saying, I'm going to see if I can make my office space a little bigger, is what I'm saying.
Well, the thing is, prorating by square footage, maybe you're becoming a little bit too granular, in the sense that it's really hard to prove that you're using, that the heating dissipates in a very significantly different way in a smaller room, right?
Well, I just did the square footage because our accountant, because I didn't write off home business expenses for several years. And then we switched accountants and he was like, let's get on the phone. And he asked me a bunch of questions. And one of them was, how much are you paying in rent and how much is your square footage and how much of that is your office? So that's why I did it that way.
I think you can even include insurance. But, that's a question for an accountant because they may put the insurance somewhere else as well as a tax deduction somewhere else if you're paying a mortgage, for example. But if you're paying renter's insurance, definitely include that as well.
I'm going to go, I'm not a tax professional, but I think your entire mortgage payment counts because like rent is going toward their mortgage. So I don't see how that's different.
Doing this calculation when you're owning the house is slightly different from when you're renting, because when you're renting, everything is an expense.
Well, this year we bought a house for the first time ever last year, and so we have to deal with it on taxes. But how I'm doing with that is I'm just providing all the numbers to the accountant, so I don't actually know how he's figuring it out.
Yeah, I organize it in such a way that it makes sense to me, and that I remember being told how to organize it, and then the accountant basically goes through it and does with the numbers whatever they think is the advisable way of doing it. And I sign off on it, of course. It's just a way for me to organize where the money's going, I guess, in some shape or form that makes sense to me.
So we've had people with like rental income on this show, but we've never really talked about it. But since we're talking taxes, how do you differentiate like those expenses and that income from all your other stuff?
It is a different source of income. It's good to think of it as, another company that you may have, which has its own expenses, it has its own income, and it has its own way of determining depreciation, et cetera, et cetera. That's basically so I have a separate spreadsheet for rental income, expenses, and depreciation that I send to my accountant. And of course, there are 1099s, et cetera, for this and that, because I have a rental management company that collects the rent. But yeah, that's how I find it the most useful to think about it, because it has its own rules and its own ways of looking at money coming in and out. It needs to be considered separately. Yeah, and of course there are people who set up an LLC just for their rentals. If they have a mom and pop Airbnb business, as an example. So it's a good way to think about it, even if you don't set up an LLC for it, because you're going to have expenses on landscaping, contractors, et cetera, and you're going to invest and repair things.
Yeah. So you just have a separate spreadsheet and you have the categories that are different for real estate, but you just have all the categories for expenses.
Exactly.
And send that off.
Yeah.
Amazing. Easy. Sounds so easy. Sounds complicated. And I'm just thinking of all the things you have to keep track of, and it's a lot.
It's It's like everything else. It's complicated when you don't have it organized in your head, or you don't know how to organize it. It's like, if you're carrying all that stuff around in your head, then it's complicated. If you make a habit out of putting it down onto paper and collecting the information and containing it in some sort of structure, it's a bit like a to-do list. When you write it down, it's a lot better than carrying it around in your head.
Yeah. And that's how I feel the first time you do taxes. It's like, that's when you get your spreadsheet together. And then the next year, it's like, okay, I just have to go through the to-do list and fill in all these blanks.
Yeah.
And if there's any new ones, or if any go away.
Yeah. I always worry that, I've earned too much money and have to pay too much taxes. And sometimes that happens. Because as a freelancer, as you know, you have to save money in order to pay your taxes. And I'm estimating how much I keep back, but sometimes I'm off, and sometimes life gets in the way, and you have to replace something expensive, and then you're like, oh wait.
All right, but okay, I'm all over the place here. Okay, so I'm going to jump to this. What is a financial mistake you've made in your life that you think other people could learn from or learn to avoid?
It's definitely not seeking out tax advice early enough, thinking you can figure it all out by yourself. And as a freelancer in the world of entertainment, I've been relying on software. I feel like I tried them all and I had to kind of go back to my system. If you are comfortable doing taxes, it's best to start really early doing them and do a little bit every other week, as opposed to trying to do it all in one big swoop, because it can be very anxiety inducing. So I recommend doing it a little bit every other week.
Yeah, I signed on to that because I've told this story on the show, which is where I tried TurboTax, and then I think the counter was at 16 hours, and I still had 2 state returns to file. And at that point, I just gave up and went back to my old way of sending it off to the accountant. But maybe had I started sooner and put in my hours a little bit more than, because I think that was over the course of 2 weeks that I got to that 16 hours.
I think everybody's situation is so different that it's hard to account for all the possibilities in a piece of software that doesn't adjust generically, which I guess if it, in the next few years, they're probably going to change with the help of artificial intelligence to some degree, but we'll see. But I also tried, all these receipt, a couple of receipt applications, and it didn't help me either, that auto scan and categorize. Maybe I don't know how to train them properly, but
No, well, okay. Do you have a specific name of one you tried?
I tried Spark Receipt and I tried Expensify multiple times.
Okay. I think I'm the same way. It just boiled down to me of like, I scan it and I categorize it in my spreadsheet because you have to do so much work with those. Just doing it on a spreadsheet and in a Dropbox folder where everything is stored, that's just the best way for me.
I do feel, with any database-based system, you do have to train them a little bit, make your own categories, et cetera, and then in theory, if it's automated, it should just work. It just didn't work for me. And the other thing is, and that's maybe more important, it didn't make me comfortable about having actually scanned and integrated my finances in any way. And I wasn't comfortable like how the different softwares talk to my bank, et cetera, et cetera. And I've always been with credit unions, and some of them don't integrate with these pieces of software. So the whole thing fell apart because TurboTax wouldn't talk to my credit union, or the sort of the database integration part when you're dealing with non-large national banks sort of was definitely a factor, but also the fact that they're all talking to each other and exchanging this information it didn't make me comfortable either. And I've always been a little bit paranoid / careful about what information gets sent over the internet one way or the other. So it was uncomfortable to me, and I was like, you know what, I'm not going to print these out, but I do going to turn them into PDFs and, file them over here on an encrypted folder or something. And then I'm good.
I'm just glad to hear it because I get so frustrated with the softwares too. It's just like, here it is, 2025, and I'm still just using spreadsheets and PDFs.
Yeah. The most satisfying way I organize my receipts now is I use Notion for just about everything. And Notion is definitely not made to tabulate your expenses. But I do it anyway because I find it really satisfying to organize all the receipts. And I find it really easy to have things auto-complete or use values and categories I have already used for other things and just apply them to blanket entries. So it's actually more... Maybe I'm not good enough at Excel, but I find Notion faster. And then I just, I organize and filter and categorize all the Notion entries and then turn all that into a spreadsheet at the end. Or I do screen grabs because it's just so nicely organized.
Okay. I want to ask you more about projection designing. You had talked about how the content tends to be separate. So I guess, can you just explain the design fee? Like if you were to do a show as a projection designer and do your media in-house, et cetera, or hire out, like what is that structure, or how are you getting paid for a show?
There's always a design fee, right? And a design fee is generally pays for the design and your presence in the room and rehearsal attendance, those kind of things, meetings. And it's usually thirds, like a third at signing, a third at load in, a third when the show opens. And that's relatively straightforward. the content side of it is separate. Usually I divide it into it's basically staff, people that do work over days or hours, whatever those people are, editors, compositors, illustrators. So there's a staff category, and then there is a direct expense category, and then there's a rental category, and then there is a miscellaneous category of expenses. And that depends a little bit on the design. The people is relatively constant in the sense you'll always need a compositor, you always need an editor, you might need a 3D animator. And that just adds up. And that's the most expensive part of it. Unless you have to go to an exotic location or do a large green screen shoot or something like that. And then I basically add a location category or acquisition category. Normally in the acquisition category, there's just things like stock footage but if there is an on location shoot requires, it's camera rental, it could be hiring a cinematographer, it could be a studio rental, it could be all sorts of stuff related to just on location stuff, which generally would be under direct expenses, but it's like a big subcategory. And then you have miscellaneous expenses at the end, which is, that always occur, like hard drives, USB sticks, and, travel, stuff like that. And that just kind of adds up to a big number usually, which is usually bigger than anybody wants to or can afford. But I use it as a starting point because I'm not making these costs up. I have some degree of flexibility in saying, hey, this is not this kind of show, so would you be willing to work for this rate? But there comes a point where I have to scale down the design if I'm not getting X amount of money, because it just can't be done without paying. If you want to pay people reasonable or standard wages or daily rates, then at some point it's just not possible to do the thing that you're being asked to do. But I've been pretty good. I mean, I've been able to pull it off. And on smaller shows, the backstop for the situation is you as a designer, because you can always, if you know how to make certain things, you can always fill in. So that's kind of what I do. And I don't pay myself for things that I would pay somebody else. Like if I go out and and film something or take pictures, okay, I have expenses of a flight or maybe in a hotel, but I don't pay myself a daily rate of X to do it. And that's how I can cut down the budget. If somebody else had to do it, then it would be expensive. So that's how I get the number down, by basically putting more on my plate. But if it's things that I can reasonably do without getting overwhelmed, or if I'm available. And if everything else fails, you just have to have a conversation with the producer or the production manager and say, listen, I don't know how we would do this. And then sometimes they say, oh, wait, I have this friend or we have this partner in the community. They actually have a TV studio, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly that cost goes away and it's kind of in-kind sponsorship or co-production or something. And then the budget goes down. But without you making the budget, nobody, in my experience, is actually aware that these costs exist. Even to this day, often there's an educational component to making these budgets and having these conversations, because most people think they're being perfectly reasonable offering you $3,000 to make imagery for a show. But if you do the numbers, that doesn't get you very far. And then, on bigger shows, people charge for studios and desk space and heating. And you get into basically that same category of direct expenses that you do when you have an home office. Think about, if you're running a big shop, you have running expenses that exist regardless of whether you're designing, there's a show being designed or not, that somehow have to be paid for. So these things also make it into the budget one way or the other, depending on the type of show it is. and even if as a small studio, you do have things you have to pay for every year, like Adobe subscriptions or things like that. They just keep going. Or you have to upgrade your hard drives or your computers. They're just ongoing things. And you can't just charge a computer to a show. They assume you have a computer. So you have to find a way to factor that in somewhere. And usually it makes it into something like called studio expenses as a fraction, which makes total sense, I think.
You mentioned in your content fee categories, you said staff direct expenses and you said rental expenses.
I have to pull it up. I think I also have it on a website that I built a long time ago. Hang on.
Your website was called like projection.com or something?
It's PROJCTN. It's old, but it has an article on projection design costs from March 2013. So there's an article that sort of breaks it all down, and then there's the middle part, which is the number 3, image production, which I wrote because it kept coming up, and people keep asking me, how do I do this? I would have to pull up one of my spreadsheets to remind myself.
No, you don't have to. I was just really asking what the rental was.
Oh, where it falls?
Or like what? Yeah, what goes into the rental expense?
What rental of what?
Well, just saying content. Like, what were you renting? Or you?
Oh, so, it depends on the design. Say, you are doing underwater imagery. You need to rent underwater camera, underwater housing. Some things are more economic to rent than to purchase, just because you use them once and never again. And you just have to make a call as to whether you're renting it or whether you're purchasing it outright. And some things are just like, say you have a high speed, you need a super slow motion sequence, and I did that once. So I had to hire a director of photography who specializes in high speed photography. They came with their own camera and their own assistant, and you just kind of have to make sure that the people that you're hiring have what they need, and you rent the equipment that they need for a daily or hourly rate, whatever that is, because that's what's required.
And you've mentioned the difference between like a small show, how you can cut back your stuff for a small show versus a large show. Are there any major differences in sort of like your process for like a big, huge budget thing versus a tiny little thing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you probably know that there is a huge difference in terms of structure and financial remuneration between a regional theater show and a show at the Met or a Broadway show, where basically a lot of things are semi fixed because of collective bargaining agreements. It feels like regionally, like everything is pretty much up for grabs, depending on what experience the particular theater company has with working with media designers. So every company, my experience, basically learns based on the people that they hire and whether the people are sharing their concerns or have productive conversations with production staff about what they need to do a good job or to succeed. And that sort of informs how they structure what they're paying for, whether they're paying for have a dedicated content budget or programmers, assistants, et cetera, et cetera. I always ask, so how are you doing this for set? How are you doing this for lighting? And then almost with like, I would say 90% certainty, I get to ask, and why is it different for projection? And then usually the answer is because X has just done this for this amount. And it's like, okay, do you think that is right? And sometimes I have conversations with these, they lead with how they're accredited or equitable, et cetera, and then it gets to those kind of conversations like, okay, help me understand how these two things square up. It is true that it is not a standardized way of working when you're working with media design. It is also true that, certainly in regional theaters, not as many shows have projection or media component as in the commercial world. So it does make perfect sense that they do not necessarily have a budgetary structure or mechanism to allow for these things. And half the time they don't even know that something actually is going to have this design component until the set designer or somebody said, oh, wait, I think we want to do this with media. And then everybody goes scrambling. And then they have to find money, and they're happy to have found the money. And they talk to somebody like me that goes like, really? It's almost productive. It's always productive, but you never get as much as you think you should be getting. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It's basically a personal decision.
Got it. So it sounds like with lighting, we know we're going to have a rental budget. With scenery, we know we're going to have to build the set. Costumes, we know we're going to have to buy and pay for building those costumes. With media, it's really just up to the projection designer. Whatever they need is going to determine it, or they don't.
It's not as bad as that. No. It used to be like this, a decade ago maybe. But there is usually a budget for rental, and there's a budget for media. It's just because it happens late in the process, it's not automatically baked in. They basically take something away from somewhere else. So maybe they take $1,000 from the lighting budget and $1,000 or $2,000 from the set budget because it's part of the set, and then you end up with $3,000. But if the set is $30,000 and your imagery budget is $3,000, and then you have maybe rental of $10,000, but they expect the imagery to basically make the set work, there's a discrepancy usually because you're trying to make something look equivalent to a real set with less money than a real set. And that then has nothing to do with imagery. That just has to do with the equipment, like projectors, brightness, resolution. It's just not cheap. Like the imagery part is a little fuzzy because it depends a little bit on the design and the design language. But the gear, if you don't have the gear, can very quickly basically eat up a lot of money and have very little control over it because you have a surface that is a certain size that has to be in conversation with the costume, the lighting, and the scenic design. So it has to be of a certain brightness. It has to be, maybe you're even projecting scenery at some point, so it has to stand up to lighting levels that are customary in a certain kind of production. Then you kind of know you need specific kind of gear. All you can do as a media designer is make a list, and it goes to the shops. Okay, sometimes the producer will say, hey, could you work with a projector that is this much less bright? Say, yes, I can, but the question is whether we can make this work for this show because, say, it's a musical. There's this big dance number that the director also wants to have a projected background here. So it's going to be a bright number. Are you okay with, it maybe not being quite as dynamic as it needs to be? As any other designer, I think with enough experience, you can predict what certain things will roughly look like. And I can do the same thing. And then it's a question of whether they say yes or no, because I'm not forcing anyone to spend tens of thousands of dollars on equipment, but I do point out what will happen when you don't.
This is interesting because I assumed when you were in conversation with the regional theaters or a theater that hasn't allotted for the budget, I assumed it was more content creation was the additional money.
It's, wherever the pain point is, it could be the equipment, it could be the imagery, it could be both.
Because I'm over here thinking it's 2025. It's really easy to get bright projectors. That's how I think.
It is, but that doesn't mean they're cheap. But it's definitely gotten a lot cheaper to hire or to purchase bright projectors in this day and age. Yeah, absolutely. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have them because they set different priorities. Or, once you have the gear, you also need to find somebody who actually responsible for them and looks after them. You need to have a staff member who kind of doubles up as the projection person, supervisor, which is usually a lighting supervisor in my experience, but it differs. In Europe, it's weird and wonderful. I had automation departments and audio departments, and all sorts of departments look after the video because the lighting department didn't want anything to do with it.
All right, Sven, I am loving every minute of this, but I need to wrap it up in about the next 10 minutes. But I have a few more questions here, which the reverse of my earlier question about a bad financial mistake. What is a good financial thing you've done in your life or career that other people could maybe emulate?
I think advocate for yourself and the value of your services. I think that's really important. Even when you're starting out, there's a sweet spot.
I have a follow-up question to that, which earlier you mentioned about the National Theater and that you were very persistent. What did that mean? Was that advocating for yourself by being persistent?
It was being persistent about getting credited for the work that I do. Because when this profession, the media design, video projector, projection designer first came about, a lot of other design disciplines took credit for the work. And then they got hired as projection or media designers, even though they didn't really know how it worked, how to make it work. I mean, it's not always intentional because, of course, in the case of set designers, they did have the overall vision for the composition. And then they just thought, oh, wait, how do I use this or do this? But I became acutely aware that when you get the credit for the work that you do, then people hire you for it. So which is why the credit then is really, really important. And it's not, and it's important that it means something to the people that could be looking at the credits. So that it has to make sense. The credit needs to make sense. It needs to mean like, oh, so that person did that. And that's how you get another job half the time, because somebody goes and sees the job and saw that you got to credit for something. And that happened to me. So I was persistent about getting credited. I feel like I designed a few shows and I didn't get credit for it, but it was fine because I was starting out at the time. I was happy to be there. But then I heard people talking about my contribution as if they did it. And I was like, wait. But it was early days. So I don't think it was all intentional. And people probably felt they had ownership, but I also felt I had ownership. And then that led me to being persistent about being credited as a video designer for some of the shows.
Okay. All right. Well, that's fantastic. I have another question about negotiating or figuring out pay. Do you ever, either with fellow designers on a project or with maybe your assistants or associates, do you ever talk with other people or help them negotiate their pay?
Yeah, I mean, definitely with associates and assistants. Yeah, if they're starting out, they're always asking for advice how to do it, what the minimum is for this, what the minimum is for that. It also, it's become less over the years because now there are some structures, particularly in commercial theater, because there is an associates group that talk to each other. But that wasn't always there. And I try to give really sort of common sense advice about what you're comfortable with and have a number that is kind of the lower end after which you are uncomfortable, and have one that's like your all singing and dancing dream number. And then see what comes back, and be really mindful about overtime, about whether you want to get paid for it or not, and look at the duration of the engagement as well when you look at rates, because having, say 6 weeks job security at a lower rate might be better than 1 week of a really high daily rate. But that's a personal decision. But I always basically advise on looking also at the bigger picture, whether you want to work for this company again. There are also things like that.
Yeah. And then also with fellow designers, have you ever worked with fellow designers to work out fees?
No. I have had conversations about the content production part with a few designers, which kind of makes sense because it's very unique to this profession, and it's very unique to, I think, those designers who work on large scales, how to structure that and how to make that work. I do think it's a very important component of what media designers do. And if you don't pay attention to the imagery production budget, you end up not earning a living wage anymore, which is why I pointed out, because you're subsidizing the making of your design with your design fee, which no other designer does. I'm not saying they don't, like, people bring their own laptops, et cetera, but sometimes the expenses are so large that, like, tens of thousands of dollars, or maybe it's $10,000. You just shouldn't pay for the content out of your design fee just because you could. It just doesn't seem right. And it doesn't compare to any other design discipline. And I always try to advocate for media, video, projection design as a design discipline, which is why I make correlations to how other design disciplines function and how they divide up their team, how the budgets are divided. And I've always done that, which is why, I'm quite passionate about, no. This is something separate, or no, this needs to be treated like this, because that way you feel you're being paid adequately for your services. And also, as a assistant, associate, you don't want to walk into a room and work with people for 6 weeks and feel like you're the worst paid person in the room. So you have to know roughly what people get paid, and you have to be comfortable with what you agreed to be paid. Those are not necessarily the same thing, depending on where you are in your career.
Yep. I know. I'm so glad you're saying that, because I've brought up kit fees as a thing on this show, because that in theater, that's not a standard practice. But for me, it's like there's all these expenses and laptops and computers and software that we're paying for out of our fees that we really need to pull out and be like, well, this is a separate cost. And so I think that's a very good point about separating the fee from the other costs.
And it's not necessarily about making extra money. It's actually allowing you to do the work well, the way you work. Meaning everybody develops a certain way of working and needs certain things. And if that is a specifically tricked out piece of gear with very specific software and some dongle thing that's attached to it, okay, that's it. But it actually makes you a better designer. So you then have to decide, are you paying for this yourself, or are you asking somebody to pay for it?
Sven, this was amazing. Is there any other random thoughts that you wanted to share that I didn't bring up or anything like that?
About finances? I know it's hard to make a living doing this work, but it's also, it's really satisfying when you do. And I feel that anybody who can make a living doing this is successful, regardless of rewards, accolades, etc.
I feel the same way. It's like we've talked to so many people on this show who I would call not like household names or not uber successful when people think of it, like they don't have Tony Awards. But my thought is anybody I've talked to on this show who's been doing this for more than 10 years or it really is their career, I'm blown away, because it can be quite challenging. And just the fact that people are doing it is incredible.
I agree.
Sven, okay, last question, I'll let you go. Where can people connect with you, and who do you want to connect with you?
I'm easy to find. I think there's one more Sven Ortel, who I think is a triathlete. I'm on Instagram, but I don't post a whole lot, other than mostly about student successes. People reach out to me via Instagram a lot and via email. I have a website, svenortel.com, and people contact me via the website. That's the best way. And if you're interested in getting an MFA, you can also email me at ASU.
Okay, perfect. And I'll also link to that projection website that you created.
It's been used by people all over the world. And they're always surprised when they learn that. I mean, it says under each article who wrote it, but they're always surprised that I wrote it. It's like, I used it on my dissertation. I used it on this. I used it on that. It's like, yeah, good. I'm glad it was useful. And I made it because I kept getting asked the same questions over and over. Nobody's fault, but I felt there must be a better way. I can just put that stuff out there.
Yeah. Well, even as we were talking, I went to look at it, and it has a lot of information on it.
It's like the FAQs of kind of media design. That was sort of my hope.
Well, after so many of your answers to questions were, well, if you go to my projection.com site.
Yeah, but that's not a conversation, right? I mean, that's just like, wait. It's like talking to like some sort of support agent who the first thing they say, did you read the FAQs? You know, like I did. I still have questions.
That's why I'm calling, right? I was expecting you would be
That's
more
why
valuable
I'm
than the
calling.
FAQs.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, Sven, thank you so much for giving us 90 minutes of your time and doing this. I really appreciate it.
Love it. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. My takeaways are: write it down, have a system, don't carry it around in your head. This is something I fall prey to all the time as I get so overwhelmed by so many things. And the reality is just write it down, put it in the document, put it on paper. Just know that that's where you're storing this information, so you don't need to keep it up in your head. And then you won't get as overwhelmed. I love that Sven said he was persistent and that he got hired by association of where he was working. That's the thing we've said so many times here, which is work begets work. You work, and while you're working, you're finding other work. So you keep on going and you keep on working. Big shows have long lead up times. I always hear that about big shows, and I wish that I had gigs that were coming up in a year or 2 years, or we had all this time. But then I was thinking, I'm just falling into the grass is greener on the other side type of thinking, because I'm currently working on a show that's in September and then another in November, and those are 4 and 6 months away. So I shouldn't be complaining. I think in my scarcity mindset, or my always want to be working and worried about the next gig, I'm always thinking, all my gigs come like the last minute. But the reality is that's not really true. Separate the production budget from the design budget. Now that goes for every design department, and it also ties into a future episode where we're going to be discussing tracking hours. Now the thing here is itemizing things as they need to be itemized. There's a cost associated to everything. And yes, a design fee has a gray area, but it doesn't include the materials for production. So make sure that you're not subsidizing anything more than you need to be. Sven's confidence with finances by having paid rent for a couple years before leaving home, I admire that about Sven. I don't really have any thoughts about it other than I just admire it. The good fortune of having purchased a home and now having rental income. Now, the taxes on that are a whole separate thing from his design LLC, but it's the same in that he has to track the expenses and the income and report that. As a designer, you can have an LLC or a corporation, or you can just be a sole proprietor. Sven mentioned that is the same for real estate. You could get a separate LLC, but you can also not have it and just file everything the same. It's not really a taxes or finances thing, it's a liability issue. If you have 3 bedrooms and you're using one as an office, divide the utilities by a third for deducting on taxes. Beverly Emmons said the same thing, and it's such an easy way of figuring out how much of your utility bill you can deduct. Do your taxes a little bit each week. I mentioned that I gave up on TurboTax, and that's partially because I tried to cram it into 2 weeks. So in January, this is our plan for next year. We're going to collect and organize all our receipts. We're going to get our Excel document filled out. Then when February 1st rolls around, we're going to have all of our 1099s and W-2s, or at least a week after February, because they're due by January 31st. So then if we're self-filing, we're going to start doing it right then in February. And if we're not self-filing, we're going to send all those materials off to the accountant. All right, this is our plan for next year. Everybody, let's get on board. I was surprised to hear that Sven has to educate and fight for projection budgets, specifically at regional theaters. It seems that half of all shows now use projections in some way, so I assume that it's allotted for. Now, admittedly, projections can be simple or complex, but I would still assume that it wouldn't be up to the designer to have to do so much educating about their needs. But like with every area of design, we have to explain what we need so that producers can help us get it. Like Sven said, it doesn't always mean upping the budget. It can be let's figure it out or who do we know type of thing. And as long as the producers know what the goal is, they can help figure that out. Sven did say that often projections come in later in the process and they maybe weren't planned for initially, so the budget wasn't there, and that might be why projection people have to defend their needs a little bit more. The common sense advice for rates and fees: know the number you're uncomfortable going below and use that. And he also mentioned that you don't want to be the lowest paid person in the room, so you need to have some idea of what people are making. And tied into that, you need to be comfortable with what you're being paid. This is an imaginary situation for me, but if I ever get to light a show on Broadway, it's going to be my first one, and I'm sure the producers are going to pay me the minimum or offer me the minimum. And I may be working with designers that are doing their 5th Broadway show or their 10th, and they're going to make more than me. And I have to be okay with that. And for the record, I am very comfortable with that. If there are any producers listening or directors that are going to direct a show on Broadway and you need a lighting designer, I'm comfortable with that. I just want that to be known. All right, that is it for my takeaways. Thank you, Sven, for sitting down with me and talking through all that. This was the second projection designer we have had on the show. The other one was Caite Hevner back on episode 93, which you can listen to at artisticfinance.com/93. And you can find today's links at artisticfinance.com/188. If you have listened this far into the episode, thank you for doing so. And let me just give my plug for our Patreon page, patreon.com/artisticfinance. Patrons get a podcast feed that is commercial free and also includes bonus content. Obviously, it is my goal to have these conversations public so that everyone can hear them. But if you do want to support me for making them happen, you can do so at patreon.com/artisticfinance. And I thank you very much. The dad joke to end the episode is about a non-binary gold prospector. They dug up a fortune in them there hills. That's it for today. Until next time, break a leg.
Thank you for listening to Artistic Finance, where we interview successful artists, leaders, and investors to help educate and inspire the creative community. To access our show notes and resources, go to artisticfinance.com. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any decision, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Artistic Finance. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.